All right. Let me see if I'm live. All right, so we are actually live. At least I think we're live. Doesn't appear to be. Oh, no, I haven't started streaming yet. No, I am. I'm streaming, but it's not showing it. What the hell? I'm in the wrong mode. For Christ's sakes, live. Okay, here we go. Just see if this is working. Oh, looks like I am working. Doesn't appear to be. Oh, no. Right. I am live, and let me just clean up this page so we can get back to this. Okay, let's see what's going on here. Today, I just want to talk about my favorite observatories, or my favorite observatory. And to be honest, there's no spoiler alert here. My favorite is HartRAO. I absolutely enjoy HartRAO. Let me just turn the sound off here. There we go. Let me just, so I don't have to listen to that in my ear. My favorite observatory is HartRAO. However, it wasn't my first observatory. So, I mean, astronomers around the world will all pick their favorite for various reasons. But in today's day and age, you really don't get a chance to actually go to the observatories and observe anymore. Basically, you put in proposals, the observations are completed, the data is sent to you. So we become effectively laptop astronomers. And it loses something. You no longer have a feel for the instrument. And after a while, and this is what worries me, and I actually listened to other videos about this too, to be honest. Not simply this video, not simply me talking about this. I remember watching somebody else, oh, this is years ago now, or I was at a presentation, it must have been, I can't even tell you when it was. But the person, and I don't even know who it was, but the person was talking about the loss of a generation. In other words, they were basically worried that because most people didn't go to observatories, they didn't have an attachment to an observatory, and more importantly, they didn't understand the limitations of the telescope they were using, or even more, they didn't use it to its maximum potential. Okay, so if I go to the spec sheets of an observatory, it'll tell me I've got so many receivers. It'll tell me the sensitivity after 1 minute of observing or 1 hour or what have you. And all that's great and wonderful. But the real answer is when you're observing, when you're at the telescope and you see the telescope operating, you start learning little idiosyncrasies of the telescope. Some just are better than others doing certain things. And now, generally speaking, it can be easily, written down somewhere and you can read about it and all that wonderful stuff. But really, there's no replacement for actually being at the observatory and operating the telescope. Now, back in the day, most times, you didn't even get to operate the telescope. They would have employed people to be the operators of telescopes, and then you would simply give them a data sheet and they would go off and observe. For example, I only did 13 hours of observation on the VLA, and that's what made up my entire PhD thesis, was 13 hours of observation on the VLA, I think at two different epochs, but in two different observing sessions, about 3 years apart. Now, all well and good, I was at the VLA. I actually went there when the observing was done. So I went there, I created the observed files, I put them in, and of course you're there while the telescope operates. But you really feel like you should be washing the dishes when you're there, when I was there. So you'd go in, you'd write these software, you just enter in your observed files, how it was going to operate, the primary calibrator, secondary calibrator, source list with interspersed with calibrators, and then finish off with the primary calibrator. And then it went off and operated, and you waited 12 hours, and then the data was given to you, and then you start processing data. And so I was there for a week for a 12-hour session, but I was processing data while I was there, and that's how it operated back then. Today, you simply don't go to the observatory. It gets sent to you. So you don't even get that feeling of, man, I should be doing something. I should be washing the dishes or something. No. So my first observatory, and let me just show you a picture of it, was Algonquin Park. Let me see if I can find a picture of Algonquin. Okay, so let's make it a little bit bigger. Well, that's terribly small, but we'll grow it up for you, blow it up. And that is horrible. That is a horrible picture, so to hell with that. Let's go into Algonquin Park, and let's take this one here. Let's see if it gives me a decent... Now, stupid. That was it. I just want to visit the image. I don't want to visit the stupid Facebook page. Okay, so here you can see Algonquin Park. Oh, that's a better picture. That's all right. So, okay, I'm just behind the times. So anyways, here's Algonquin Park. It's a 42-meter telescope, and this is Lake Traverse in the background, and this is a national park in Canada, or a provincial park rather, called Algonquin Park. And to get here, you have to drive about 2.5 hours on logging roads from the main highway, which is coming from Ottawa to Deep River. Deep River is famous for being the place where they built the first nuclear pile, not nuclear pile, but they built a reactor, a nuclear reactor. And they put it here, they put it in this area simply because there's no chance German spies could go there and be not noticed by the locals and security. Anyways, but the observatory was built in the park itself. I can't remember when exactly it was built, but it's 42 meters in diameter. And I first went there to work. My first observing run was in the fall of 1984. And I remember because I didn't even have a driver's license. I think I was 23 at the time. Was I 22? And no, it was probably the spring of 1985. And so I had to get my driver's license prior to being able to rent a car and drive it to this observatory. And so my first trip driving a car by myself was to drive to Algonquin Park through a blinding blizzard. There were spots where I couldn't see a damn thing, and of course you just have to drive. And when you get to the gates of the provincial park, you had to stop, phone, of course before cell phones obviously, and then you had to phone ahead to the observatory and say, you're at the gate, you're now entering. If something happens to be, come and look for me after 2.5 hours. I think it took only 2 hours actually. So this is Algonquin Park, and I used it a number of times, and I loved it. It was great. And of course, wandering through the park trails and stuff like that, going swimming in the lake, middle of winter, there's the snow and the animals. I saw a moose jog beside me while I was driving. I wiped out, actually, the first time I entered the park. I went into a 360, but luckily the ditch was actually built up by snowbanks, and I just bounced off it and stayed on the road. But anyways, the observing itself was relatively successful, though I never used a single bit of it in my master's or PhD theses. I don't know why I didn't in the end, and in fact, my first exposure to spectroscopy and masers was looking at water masers using this telescope. And again, I never published any of that, and it's all been lost now. So this is Algonquin Park, my first observatory, and I loved it. I loved it. But it isn't, and then of course, the next one I used was in fact 5 colleges, this one here. 5 colleges radio astronomy observatory outside Boston, outside Amherst, Massachusetts. Okay? And it was a millimeter telescope, so there I went to look for outflows, etc. in the sources. And again, this data I never used. So here's 2 observatories I used, and I enjoyed being at them, but I actually never used the data, either in my publications or actually in my thesis itself, okay? But finally, then of course, this is the telescope I actually did use for my PhD, the VLA, and I basically looked at star forming regions that I had identified as being the coldest sources in the IRAS catalog, and I used this telescope to look at them at various frequencies, and look at the H2 region structure, etc., stuff like this. And as I said, I really didn't worry about masers at the time, but the idea was to prove that they were ultra compact, that they were very young sources, simply because they were the coldest sources in the IRAS catalog, at least from the calibration, from the set of criteria that I had created for my thesis was telling me. And that was it. My whole PhD was based on 13 hours on this telescope, not on the many weeks I spent at the other 2. Okay? But those are not the observatories I fell in love with. It is this one. This is HartRAO, and this is a whole bunch of images of it. Okay? So this observatory, Hartebeesthoek Radio Astronomy Observatory, is found in South Africa, just north of Pretoria. And it was selected by NASA in must have been the late 50s or mid-50s, and it was selected as a site where they wanted to actually build a 60-meter telescope or a 70-meter. They wanted to build a very large one, simply because all of the orbits of their space program went directly overhead of HartRAO of South Africa. So it was just based on their orbits around the Earth, and that meant they had a great place for telemetry and communications, etc. But because of apartheid, they were concerned that they would be putting a very powerful instrument in South Africa, that they decided to go with the smaller version. This is the 26 meter that they built in 1960. So let me just sort of walk you through this. Here's the observatory, here's the rooms, the main offices for all the workers, the technical staff is at the back. This is the 26 meter telescope sitting at zenith. This is a laser ranging system to satellites so that they can do that sort of science. And ultimately, this place has got 2 or 3 of these systems in place. It has all of the major geodetic experiments that go on, and it's got 3 hydrogen masers, etc. So it was fast becoming one of the fiducial points on the world, simply for its geodesy. Never mind the astronomy side of it. Okay, let's make sure we do something here. So it became a very, let me get my lips working here, but if astronomy, if VLBI was important, this was a very important station, because it represented the very longest baseline on almost every VLBI experiment that goes on the Earth. In particular, geodesy, it is the only spot in Africa that we have a very accurate position to tie all of the other experiments to. And therefore your GPS and all that stuff is guided by this in Africa, largely. So HartRAO's got a really important history by NASA and then handed over to South Africa in 1976 when the US government divested. I only arrived at this observatory in 1991. So it had been there. My boss, George Nicholson, just a great guy. He got his first job, was in the late 50s. He got his first job at HartRAO. And it's funny, I think I've told this story, but I'll tell it again. He basically was told he wanted to do astronomy. And his uncles, he had 3 uncles, they convinced his dad to talk him out of it. And he went into electrical engineering instead. And he thought, well, okay. They said, look, there's no future in astronomy. And his very first job out of university was, in fact, at a radio telescope. So by default, he got to do his PhD in astronomy on this telescope. So I just thought that was a really nice story, and of just how ironic things work, right? It's just amazing that, you want to do something and then they get talked out of it, then you wind up doing what you really wanted to do. Now, this telescope was used in several of the NASA missions to the moon, and also, but it was really built to spy on the Russians when they went to Venus, to be honest. They wanted to, intercept the mission transmissions coming back from the mission, from Venus. And that's why it was built, and that's why it had to be done and completed by the 1st of July, 1961. So they poured concrete for the pad where the telescope sits on December 25th, 1960, and 6 months later, it was completed and that telescope was operational. Now, not in the form it is there, but it was operational for its time. So I got there in 1991, and I sort of started working with a guy named Mike Gaylord, who we were doing similar work on star formation. So we worked a lot together. We did a lot of our papers together. In fact, I did all of my papers at Hart with Mike until, unfortunately, he died in 2013 or 2014 of cancer. But just the environment. Like, I don't think, now I've got off topic. I've been talking about the history of HartRAO, but I got off topic. My point I want to convey here is that just getting data to process, especially as a graduate student, I think you're missing out. I think you're losing out. You want to be here. Now I can tell by looking at this picture, so many things, okay? So firstly, they're not observing, they're at zenith. That's the first thing you can tell. So they're obviously doing maintenance. That's the first thing you can tell from this picture. Because that telescope If it's not doing maintenance, it's observing. Okay, that was George Nicholson's main shtick. He wanted the telescope always operating, and I think that was one of his best features of his directorship. The other thing you can tell from this, it's the middle of winter because there's no green grass. Okay, everything is brown. So it's the middle of winter. This is the dry season. So when you walk around in these hills, you'll find warthog, you'll find game, you'll find you won't see a leopard. Like they'll just disappear away from you. Likewise, the baboons. You will never see the baboons in the wild. You'll never walk into them, and if you did, you'd be running for your life because the goddamn things will probably kill you. So the baboons were always human, non-friendly. The monkeys would come a little closer. In fact, the funniest story I can tell you is once upon a time we had a bunch of monkeys up on the dish and in the electronics rooms, and they of course chew on the wires, which is bad. So we had monkeys up on the subreflector, which is here, and you can see it there. There's the subreflector. Anyways, and I had to go up there and run around to try to get them off. Now, there's no way to tie yourself off up there, so you're literally just holding on and you're 100 feet in the air. When this telescope's at zenith, you're 100 feet in the air. And so I had to run around and chase the monkeys off. And it was quite funny because people were down watching me while I was doing this. Then, of course, you come down the ladder, which is on this leg here on the south side. And then you basically work your way down the infrastructure down to the leg ladder here, and then you're down. So I mean, you really were intimate with this telescope. You were right up on it. I remember climbing up the ladder, and I don't think I can show you a good picture of it, but there's a spot where there's a vertical ladder going up. It's in this area here on this side, and effectively, you have to sort of climb up a ladder. Well, I was holding on to a 12 gigahertz receiver, which we were doing methanol with some of the first experiments. Well, it was some of the experiments we were using, and I had my hand holding on to the thing while I was climbing up the ladder, and my buddy was ahead of me and he stood on my hand. So now I got to decide, my life is more important or my receiver? And I refused to let go of that receiver. I just held on and put up with it and told him to get off my hand. Then we carried on and we installed it. Okay? And on another occasion, that same receiver, I think it was my 6.7 gigahertz, early 6.7 gigahertz receiver, in fact, I had to be tied inside the receiver cone, which is here. Let me see if I can make it bigger. There's the receiver cone here. And this is the subreflector. I had to be tied inside there. And what I would do is I would rotate the receiver 45 degrees every 45 minutes. So we would observe, and then I would rotate it. Let me start observing. And I just keep doing it because I didn't want to lose time going to zenith, climbing up the telescope, making the changes, and then coming back down. It wasted too much time. I wanted to do the polarization, and the only way we could do it was with a single pole. So we just rotated it ourselves physically. I tried to publish that, of course, and it got thrown out, and it just caused me to get into a lot of trouble. And I probably told the story, but I basically sent an email at the time to Jim Cohen and just basically said him GFY, which I'm not going to translate. You could figure out for yourself what it stands for. I was pissed. The guy was telling me I didn't know, all the work we'd done was such great work, and now we do this poor kind of observing session. There was nothing else we could do. We couldn't build a full Stokes parameter receiver system. We didn't have the money for that kind of thing. And so we had to do with what we had. And I thought it was reasonable because I was able to compare it to the work coming off of Algonquin, or rather off Parks, I should say. Anyways. So this is HartRAO, and this is the place I really enjoyed working at. I tell you what, you could sit in, and George made the comment, and I agree absolutely with him. George's office would be looking right at the observatory. It was the first office at the entranceway, looking right at the telescope. And he said he could tell by the sounds what was wrong with the telescope if something happened. He knew immediately, and he was up and he was talking to the right. And I can believe that because you just got used to it. You could hear things. In fact, he heard when the one bearing failed. He actually heard it fail. You could tell the sound of the telescope suddenly made a different sound, and he knew what that had to be. And then they had to jack the telescope up, literally lift the dish up 1 inch or 2 inches pull the bearing out and replace it with a new bearing. And that was a real effort and a half. And they didn't even want to do it. They were talking about just let the telescope mothball and build a new telescope somewhere else. And then eventually we were able to convince him. In fact, I just started working at the Department of Science and Technology, and I convinced the department that we wouldn't want the telescope to go mothball because it would look badly on our investment in astronomy in the world. And they may not see us as a serious force when we were trying to bid to host the square kilometer array. So I think I was successful, although I think they were all in line with doing it anyways in the end. But I certainly helped a bit, my small part, to ensure that HartRAO continues observing today was to convince the government to fix it. And they went ahead and fixed it. So yeah, this is HartRAO. There's lots of pictures and stuff like this. And it's at the bottom of a valley. And so even if you're, like this valley here is actually 300 meters below the plane that you drive down into it. So it protects it from radio interference. Unfortunately, there are a couple gaps in the valley where there's weather stations, etc., that are situated, and that causes RFI to this day. It actually bounces off the side of a hill into the telescope. So yeah, this is my favorite telescope. Really, it is. As I said, I've been to 18, I don't think I've said this. I visited or worked with 18 different telescopes around the world in 11 countries. But this is by far and away my favorite. And it always will be. I can tell you with no exaggeration that in my first 2.5 years of observation, of working at HartRAO from 91 to 93, I was involved in over 50% of the observing in HartRAO. So about, well, let me say, so that was about 4,500 hours I was involved in. So about 2,000 hours of that was VLBI, which I was just a tape changer. So it wasn't my science. I wasn't the primary scientist. It was none of that. I was just a tape changer. And I actually got my name on these papers that they would publish with like 150 authors. But I mean, it's not something I would ever refer to as one of my publications. I did nothing. I really just changed tapes. And it was good fun, but really I just changed tapes. Now, the remaining 2,000 hours was mine. So 2,000, 2,500 hours VLA, VLBI, and then 2,200, 2,500 hours was my actual observing, where I did surveys looking at all of these star-forming regions I had identified from the IRS catalog for my thesis. We spent hours upon hours doing this. And to this day, I probably process a couple hours a day. So I probably do 1,000 hours of data processing a year still. And I'm involved, I mean, so that observing would be, I probably still get something like 1 or 2 hours a day of observing on HartRAO. So that's 1/24th of the observing time on this telescope. And there's lots of other data that if people need, I can process it and then send it on to them or help them out, whatever. So I carry on doing this. Even though I no longer work there, I still process data. I still publish results from this telescope. And I'm kind of a purist. I tend to focus on single dish astronomy, not because I simply like this telescope, but because there's so much more knowledge in your data, and we tend to stop looking once we've found what we're looking for. Sounds weird to say that, but it's the truth. You really have to look deeper. You have to look into your data and say, what can I extract from this? And I continually try to look deeper into my data sets to see if I can extract more, because as a telescope, single dish in itself, there's so much knowledge you can extract from this thing. And it's a lost art because people quickly move to VLBI. So yes, we can see flares, we can see polarization, well, not polarization, but we can see periodicity and things like that, and we can do detections and whatnot. But everybody quickly runs off and does interferometry, and then they publish that. But I mean, it's a bit of a, you get these wonderful images in interferometry, but when you can monitor, you suddenly extend the life of a telescope like this, and that's precisely what's happened around the world. A lot of the older single-dish telescopes, yes, they're used in VLBI mode, but they're also monitoring facilities. Okay? So this is what HartRAO's become. It's become a time domain science machine. And it's really done a good job. It's made some major discoveries, and it's led to it's actually, we were an integral part in the formation of the M2O, Maser Monitoring Organization. Claire Flanagan was a big player in measuring glitches of pulsars back in the 80s. George Nicholson was doing X-rays towards Circinus X, which was believed to be the first black hole that people thought was a black hole. But so my point is, it could do good science, and I try to extract that from it. So you, in the end, when you work at an observatory like this, you really become an operational astronomer. And so you're always looking for better ways to observe and more ways to extract more knowledge from your data. And then from that, you actually find, in turn, you find better ways to observe. It's like a nice cycle. Okay? Yeah, now that's HartRAO. Now, that's the images of it. But, I mean, the things you can do in Africa, and this is an example. Let me just show this great picture. This is a picture of me at one of the national parks, and I got to get into the cage with a spotted leopard and a black leopard. And here's the one cub crawling on my back. And you could get in and pet lions, and you go to see elephants. We were in the middle of a herd of elephants. It's just, like a 3-hour drive from the observatory, and you're in a park where you see, herds of elephants, or you're right beside rhinoceros, or you have an elephant or a lion walking around your car, and just that sort of natural experience that you're in. It made the environment and working there even more pleasurable. And of course, because I was in South Africa, I love rugby. I got to play rugby in one of the best countries in the world for rugby. So South Africa, the Springboks have won the World Cup now 4 times. And they hold the record right now above New Zealand. New Zealand was at 3, they're now at 4. So it's between New Zealand and South Africa, which country is producing or winning the most World Cups, and right now it's South Africa. And I got to play. So I got to play alongside with some international players that played in those World Cups. Some of them are good friends of mine. Anyways, it's just the environment, like, the atmosphere of the observatory. But to be honest with you, I felt comfortable there. I would sit at my desk and I would process data, and I would go out and go for walks in the bush, or I would just go out and sit under the telescope, or I'd go up the telescope when they're doing maintenance. And then you could stand at the very top of the telescope. So let me see here. I'll show you. So you could stand up here, literally at the very top. This is the ladder that gets you up to the subreflexor. You can stand up there and you can surf. You can actually surf. So you got to have some good balance. You got to have no fear of heights, obviously, because to get up there, it's an effort, right? And in fact, here's a better view. This is the area where you have this vertical ladder going up into the dish structure and onto the dish itself. And to get to this spot here, you have to step across from the ladder and the infrastructure to get across. And there's a nice gap going down about 60 feet. And so most people, if they're afraid of heights, this is the point where they turn back, right here. You might be able to get them up the ladder. They'll climb up. They'll keep their eyes closed pretty much. But you can get them up there and into the structure. But the moment you ask them to step across that gap, it's just too much for them. And I saw many a person turn back, right? But I mean, I love the heights. So, I mean, for me to be up here on the top, I loved it. Absolutely enjoyed it. I don't know if I do it now because my balance sucks. I can't feel my one foot from an injury in rugby. I tore my Achilles heel, which my supervisor used to threaten to do to me because he hated how much time I spent playing rugby over astronomy. And yet, I got to tell you, for every hour of rugby I played, I did 2 hours of research. So I used to spend 12 hours a day in the observatory at the university, and I spent 6 hours a day training or playing rugby. So, yeah, he didn't mind rugby, but he didn't like me doing rugby. He wanted me to focus my efforts doing astronomy. But I got to tell you something. When I was at this observatory, it was heaven. It was heaven. I just don't care what people say. You know, if you go to the VLA, if you go to an observatory and you just watch this thing operate and you see the results coming off it, you just feel like you're closer to it. You feel like you're closer to your source. Like those millions of kilometers, those light years away that the source actually is from you, they feel like a few kilometers when you're at the observatory. You feel connected. And I find that kind of a mindset, that kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? It just develops a passion in you for what you're doing. Like, can you imagine the old astronomer sitting at the eyepieces of a 2-meter telescope, staring up at the sky trying to find something, or, you know, people looking for planets, you know, looking for Pluto, etc. That is precisely what I'm referring to. Okay? So when you're actually there at the observatory, we actually could hear the sound because we could turn on the speaker and you could hear the sound coming in from the telescope. So you get this sort of a crackling sound. It didn't sound like much, but it was a crackling sound. That's what you were receiving, okay? But irrespective, that wasn't really what you, I mean, I could see the stuff coming off the computer as it was being observed. And then I could tell if there was something wrong. I could fix it quickly, and then we could re-observe and things like that. And so it was just so much more better to actually be at the observatory. And like I said, I got the good fortune of being able to climb up this thing many times and sort of become intimate with it. No, that's the wrong way. That sounds bad. That's not what I meant. Strike that from your mind. What I'm trying to say is you just knew the telescope so well, and you could just tell if something was right or wrong about it. Like George said, he could tell by the sound in his office if something was wrong, and he would be up and gone to fix it, because that's what he did. He made sure this telescope always operated. And you know, when you take away the astronomers from the facility and now you just have engineers there and it's all remotely done, what ends up happening is it becomes a tinkering instrument, because the engineers are now the people managing the telescope, and they will always find a reason to say, oh, we have to do some maintenance, or we have to go up and do something. And that was the case. So in the 90s when I was there, only during the daytime was that the case. As soon as after 4:30, there was never any need for maintenance, it seemed. And before 8 o'clock in the morning, no reason for maintenance. Weekends, no reason to have the telescope turned off. So it was funny how maintenance always occurred during a weekday. You know? Now, they used to, you know, they would schedule maintenance periods and stuff like this. But like I said, George was very keen to ensure the telescope was maximally used. Now, it was all well and good when the anti-center was directly ahead. That's during the day. So that was fine. But when the galactic center was overhead, it was a pain in the ass because it affected a lot of my observing. A lot. Anyways, yeah, so as I said to you, this really is my favorite observatory. Was there anything else I wanted to show you? Oh, yes, and something else I want to talk about. This is just briefly. I had a thumbnail I showed you yesterday in the hard-working video. And the reason I wanted to show that video is, or that's just an example, this fireplace my brother and I built. My brother Alec built. Now, let me be clear. I did none of the masonry. I just mixed the mortar and carried the stone, and that's what I did. Now, the bigger problem with this particular job was that because they had put down the hardwood before we built the fireplace, we weren't allowed to use any kind of motorized equipment to lift the stone into place. So everything had to be done by hand. And this particular stone here, and there's two of them because this is a 360 fireplace. There's stone on the other side. This thing here weighs 1,200 pounds. So it took 8 of us to carry it into the room, and then Alec and I had to jack it up and shimmy it into place. And we had to design the back end of this thing, the back side, the guts of the fireplace, to be able to cantilever this weight so that it didn't fall and damage the floor or anybody, for that matter. But this is all real stone, absolutely gorgeous. This house, I think, cost $6 or $7 or $8 million. It was absolutely phenomenal. It was owned by some sort of tech executive, you know, some subsidiary of one tech company. Some Canadian subsidiary of a tech company. This was the person, this is where their cottage was. This was a cottage. It had 12 bedrooms. I don't know, crazy, something like that. But you could, it's beautiful, just beautiful. But I wanted to explain what that figure, that thumbnail was from yesterday. I just simply wanted to show the artistry. So if I show you this, okay, and let me see if I can show you something else. Let me go to some data. Let's go to my sources. Let me see if I can find an image of something I find interesting. Let's go into here. Let's go into images. So what I'm trying to show you here, and this is what I want to talk about basically. I'm not going to talk about this data again. I showed this yesterday to you. But just look at this. This is beautiful. This is an art form. This is an art form. Stonemasons are artists. This is an art form. But to me, this is the art that I work with. For many of you who do astronomy and you make your pretty pictures, that is your art. You're creating an image that you can then display to somebody, and then from it they can infer what you're talking about. This is an art form. This is an astronomer's art form. This is for single dish astronomy. This is as good as it probably gets. Okay, you do spectra and stuff like that, but this is really as good as it gets on a single dish telescope. You can make very coarse maps, as they once did with a single dish, but really I leave that to the interferometry people, because they can just make far more prettier images than I could ever make, and especially the infrared people, like what comes off the James Webb and whatnot. Okay, so but this is my art. So in this case, I'm the artist. In this case, my brother Alec is the artist. But nonetheless, I got to help him do this, and I take certain pride in that. You know, we did such a nice job. So, you know, and I think that's the key to the story. You know, whatever you do, whatever you choose to do, I don't care, you know, you don't have to be a construction worker to work hard, but take pride in your work. And what I am trying to say is that astronomy, you know, like going to the observatory, you know, take pride in being, like I was very proud to be an astronomer at HartRAO, and I would tell people all the time. And people say, oh, you know, like they would never have heard of it before, what have you. It didn't matter. It didn't matter. We were astronomers. However little I got paid, I was an astronomer. And it was like, you know, it's like kind of, it wasn't what I dreamt of being when I was a kid, but it's as close as I got. I wanted to work in space. I wanted to be a construction worker in space. I wanted to be an astronaut, but I wanted to do construction work in space. It sounds strange, but I saw myself as a construction worker in space. And that's the best way I can describe it. But at least I got to work on a telescope that actually participated in the space programs. So when they do deep space telemetry and they needed something like HartRAO to communicate, you know, I don't think they'd used it for that, but for the Apollo missions, they certainly did. So, you know, that's how close I got to my dream, okay? And I got to shepherd an astronaut around South Africa to give talks. And I would give presentations, but this guy was clearly the star of the show. Every time he showed up, everybody wanted to hear from him. They sure as hell didn't want to hear from me. But I got to do that for a week, for 2 weeks. I got to shepherd a guy around with a bunch of other astronomers, and we gave talks, and that we had media calling us and interviewing us and stuff like that. And I got to do that because I worked at this telescope. Okay? I was doing that particular job because I had a job at the Department of Science and Technology, and this was one of our things to promote astronomy and science in South Africa, and I got to be the person responsible for the entire meeting, for the entire trip. And it was great fun. It was just great fun. And he was a great guy. He was the guy that fixed the Hubble telescope, one of them. Jeff, geez, and I always forget his last name. Anyways, it'll come to me. But the upshot of the story is he was one of the guys that fixed the Hubble telescope. Oh, okay, while we're here, I'll just Google it, because that's what you do. You just Google stuff. Hold on. Let me just get rid of this business here. Let's just find it. Okay, they got Mike Massimino, but that's not the character. There was a whole bunch of them that worked on it. I got to remember who was all on that mission that fixed it. He was one of them. Where was the other guy? They keep giving it to, no, he's another couple. Come to me, the man who fixed. Oh, there'll be someone's name. It'll come to me. There'll be a picture of the characters that did it, and we'll just try to. That's fine. Just don't worry about that. This is the character, Mike. And he was an astronomer. And I want to tell you that he was an astronomer too. And they always, geez, got people hair loss. What do I care about that? Screw it. To hell with it. I can't remember the guy's name. It'll come to me some other time. But he was an astronomer as well. And he said to me, he says, you know, you had to see being an astronaut as plan B. And then lucky for him, he got in. And he was right off the bat one of the first from the... he was one of the first in the space shuttle program. And because he was quite tall, he was about 6 foot, 6'2", of course, he would never have qualified for the Apollo missions because you had to be quite short. Anyways, he was quite lucky that they suddenly said you could be taller, and he got in. And then, of course, he got a bit of, he had some spacewalk training. And when they had to start doing the Hubble fixes, he was one of the guys that was given that opportunity, and he did it. Yeah. Anyways, it was just kind of cool. So I never got to be an astronaut, never got to work in space, never got to fix things like the Hubble, but I got to meet the people that did it. I got to work with the equipment that was part of the space programs. You know, and I listen to people going on about, they never landed on the moon. It's all fake. I had a conversation with one of my friends. He's a Native American here. He's an Aboriginal here in Canada. And I was like, I'm going, man, are you crazy? I told you, I actually worked with the people that worked on the Apollo missions. You just sit there, you think, I'm just pulling my hair out. I don't have any hair. So, and by the way, just as a thought, I should say this. I lost my hair at Tipatinga, at the observatory in Brazil, at Tipatinga. Now, it sounds stupid. I didn't have an accident or anything like this. I obviously picked up some kind of a bug in the rainforest because the Tipatinga is right at the edge of the Amazon rainforest. And I must have picked up some sort of infection or bug or something like that. And by the time I got on the plane to fly back to Canada, I was so ill. And then when we landed, I couldn't hear properly. I was having trouble seeing. The next day I had to go to the doctor, and they thought I had mono. And I'm like, how can I have mono? And one of my friends was on station. He was a intern because he just finished his medical degree, and he and I played rugby at university together. And he basically said he saw my name and he come to visit me, and he says, you looked at my chart because you don't have mono. And he says, you got some kind of a tropical disease, because his family had traveled around the world in ambassadorial positions, and he worked at embassies. His father worked at embassies around the world, and he traveled a lot in the tropics. So he recognized some of these characters. Anyways, no one could tell me what it was, but all I can tell you is in the course of several months, I started losing my hair like I had cancer. So, a word to the wise, when you go to observatories, they are in exotic places, generally speaking. They're on top of mountains, in the middle of deserts, or they're in sometimes tropical rainforests or arboreal rainforests, for that matter. So you have to, you gotta take care. And of course, I didn't. So I got back. I eventually developed asthma, lost hair, and started getting gout at the age of 30 or 32, was it? But I mean, I haven't been able to eat any form of red meat or any kind of meats like pork or anything. I can eat none of that stuff, not at all. All because of a sickness I got while working at the Tipatinga Observatory in Brazil. Now, that Brazilian observatory is famous for discovering Orion KL water maser that shot up to millions of Janskis. And so it's really quite a famous observatory, although I doubt most people know about it or have ever visited it. And I don't even know if it's I think it's still functional. I think it still works. I'm not sure how much. And the guys that worked there, they were great. Like I was at in Sao Paulo with the institute that managed it. And the researchers there, they were just excellent. It was a great close-knit team of people. We had a lot of fun. I got into a lot of trouble in Brazil, and I barely got out with my life, not least of which the disease. I'm talking about other issues, because it was just dangerous. I mean, I say that in a, just the craziness that went on. And mostly because I'm I'm not risk averse, so I tend to do stupid things. So, yeah. But what am I doing here? Let's see if I can... Where's the OBS? Why am I not seeing... Okay, no, that's fine. Anyways, so all I'm trying to say here is that this is my favorite observatory, HartRAO, Hartebeesthoek Radio Astronomy Observatory. I went for 2 years. I had a postdoc for 2 years, stayed for 6. And then I decided, to hell with this, I'm leaving. I was, as they say in Afrikaans, hut full. I'd had it up to here, whatever expression you want to use. And it wasn't because I didn't like observing. It was because the politics was just becoming, I don't know, I didn't really like, I just sort of was on the out. There was a guy that was being brought in and groomed to be the new director. And he turned out to be a real... I don't know, I'm not going to say anything bad about him, but I mean, I just didn't get along with them. And a couple of us didn't get along with them. And it caused some friction. And then unfortunately, it put me at odds with George, my boss, because he really liked this guy and really wanted him to take over. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe George will tell me something different. Maybe he'll watch this and then send a comment to tell me something else, and I hope he does. But I mean, fair play. I mean, I like the guy. I mean, I met him years later, and we chatted, and he's a nice guy. I mean, I got along with him. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's no animosities. But at the time, I was ultra aggressive. I was young, and I was bordering on violent aggressive when I was young, because I played rugby all the time. I wanted to play world-class rugby, and I played at a cutting edge, and it was all because I was so aggressive. And largely, I hated the world most of the time because of my upbringing and that's what gave me an edge to play rugby. But sometimes it carried over into my astronomy career, and it made for problems. It just made for problems. So you could imagine poor Mike Gaylord, he and I writing papers together, and Mike was a stickler for perfect English. And English is not my first language. English is my second language. In fact, I learned real English when I moved to HartRAO. And that sounds really bizarre, but I got taught proper English when I moved to HartRAO because I had Mike Gaylord correcting my papers all the time, Dirk Smith correcting my papers all the time, and then one of the technicians, Peter Stalker, would correct my papers all the time. Those 3 people had exceptional English skills. And it made me a better English speaker as a result. And it made my papers more understandable. Probably why some of my earlier papers weren't well received. It was just not well written. And it makes a difference. So I learned all of this at HartRAO. My first language, if you want to know, is swearing. So I grew up in a construction family. I have 11 brothers and 2 sisters. We fought and swore and cursed. Our mother hated it because she never swore it, and she used to beat the hell out of us for it, but she never got it out of us. So my idea of a language is cursing and swearing every second word, and you can see I've not done that. So every now and then it'll slip out, but generally speaking now I try to speak better. And I still fail, by the way. I still fail. But when I'm writing, I write like a scientist, taught by Dirk, Peter, and most importantly, Mike Gaylord. These 3 people taught me how to write better science papers. They just did. Their writing skills many levels ahead of mine. There's no question. In fact, recently I saw a paper by a young postdoc at University of Western Ontario, Fereshte, and she's going to get mad at me because I'm going to forget her surname. She was an Iranian student. Now she's a professor at University of Waterloo or something like that. Sorry, Fereshte, I can't remember your surname. And I read one of her papers that I was a co-author on. I've never read a paper in my life where I didn't have to make one correction on. That paper was the first ever. The English was impeccable. Every word was in the right place and used correctly. Every word. And there was an economy of words. She didn't run on sentences. None of that. She just wrote an absolutely beautiful article. And the referee, when they reviewed it, said the exact same thing. So it wasn't just my opinion, a person who's not a really good English speaker, right? So it was really impressive, really. But from me, I learned everything at HartRAO, this observatory here. This observatory is where I learned to speak English. This is observatory where I really learned to do single dish astronomy and look at spectroscopy and beginning to understand spectroscopy. And you start noticing things. If you spend 4 hours a day, every day for 6 years, staring at data, staring at spectra, squiggly lines as I call them, you become pretty goddamn good at it. You start, they talk about the 10,000 hour rule, right? So if you work out, how many hours a day you're doing that, and it becomes a sixth of your life, well, that's 1 year. Well, that's more than 10,000 hours. So my point is that, you just become that good at it. You just become that good at it. And you see things, and people will say, whatever. And then I would talk to my friends, and they would show me some of their data, like, what about that? Oh, this is interesting. And they go, oh, what? And they hadn't even noticed it. Because for them, I don't know, you just have to have, it would be like a world-class batsman in cricket or baseball. They get their eye in, and they can see the 100-mile-an-hour pitch or the 160-kilometer-an-hour fast bowling. They could see it. They see the ball coming at them, and then they take their swing at the bat, okay? And it's the same in this case. If you spend thousands upon hours staring at this data, you start noticing things. For me, HartRAO data is precisely that. If I see HartRAO spectra, I can tell if there's RFI, radio frequency interference. I can determine how long they're observing from the RMS, root mean square noise, all of this stuff, because I've looked at the data for so many years, And so you start seeing things. And, I'll give you an example. We never discovered the periodicity in G9.62 in the early 90s. Sharmila Goodhart did in the year 2003. She published that. Okay, she saw it because she had an excellent cadence of observing over several years to see the periods. And she couldn't say anything until they had enough data to get 6 flares. Can you imagine 6 cycles? Whereas we were monitoring that source, we monitored it off and on, and we saw that it was flaring. We knew it varied, but we never looked at it enough and we never ever gave any thought to the possibility of periodicity in these damn things. Although I did look for periodicity in G351.78 because I could almost predict when it was going to flare because I just saw it in the HartRAO data. I could just tell that the spectra looked like it was changing because I looked at it so often. Now, that doesn't make it periodic. It's probably episodic. But Sharmila, to her credit, she actually took another source, and it was extremely bright and very easy to see the periodicity in the 12.2 especially and the 6.7. So, just a great job by her. But at the time, I wasn't as good at it, is what I'm trying to say. So if I had a better eye, I might have noticed some trends that I should have actually jumped onto. I should have monitored that source as often as I monitored 351.78, and we would have a totally different discussion today. But that didn't happen. If shoulda, coulda, woulda kind of mindset, right? But regardless, all the credit to Sharmila Goodhart. She did an amazing job, an amazing piece of astronomy. And for a graduate student to have to sit there for 3 more cycles, she knew it was periodic, but she had to wait before she could tell anybody. That would have been absolutely hard to do. And I wished I'd been there to sort of enjoy it with her, to be honest. And then when it came out, people bitched and bellyached because they looked at a small telescope like this. They go, this is Africa. How could a telescope like that discover something as amazing as periodic methanol masers? And they didn't believe her work. They published an article in an American journal. I forget the woman. I think it was Virginia Trimble, but I might be outing the wrong person. But whoever it is, they deserve to be outed. Because that was completely asinine to make that kind of a comment. It's just, to me, it's wrong on so many levels to look at an observatory like this just because it's small and in Africa and treat it like it's not going to be able to do good science. I mean, that would be like me looking at, I don't know, the telescope in Ghana and saying that it'll never do good science. I mean, what the hell's wrong with people? You know, you get a culture of good observing and you'll get good observations. I don't care where you are. So all of you budding young observatories out there, and I like to work with those people, all those people that work at them, just do the best you can do all the time. Practice, do better practices. I don't believe in best practices. Best practices is always backward looking. So I always refer to it as better practices. Always practice better practices. So always try to improve your observing. Always try to improve the sensitivity of your telescope. Always look for ways to get more from your observatory and more from your data. And that is what you should be doing. And I hope you can tell from the way I talk about this telescope in particular, I'm extremely proud of the results coming off HartRAO. Always am. And the success of people like Claire Flanagan, George Nicholson, Dirk Smits, when he discovered the flare in Monarch 2 back in 1997 in the excited OH masers. I mean, this is the precursor to the discovery of the accretion events that we saw in 2015, because this telescope was monitoring and it demonstrated to others that this is an opportunity in science for them to do some good science. And the Polish group, for instance, look what they've done in the years that they've been monitoring. Okay? And they were the group that published the second set of periodic methanol masers, which confirmed that what Sharmila saw in the first place was real. So, and that in itself actually was the idea in my head that said, hey, we should be really working together with observatories around the world when we do monitoring. And it was part of the thought process that went into the creation of the M2O. Because in the very first meeting, it really came about because a couple of us probably had these thoughts all at the same time. I know when I was talking to Willem Bon at the 2017 conference, I said to him, we should actually try to coordinate. And he said, that's a good idea. And he went off and talked to other organizers who also said they'd been having these kinds of thoughts. So it wasn't any one person, it was a group of us. And I would definitely say that. I'd like to say it was my idea. And I certainly was the one that said it to Willem, and I was the person responsible for the first meeting. I was the person at the front of the room, talking with everybody what we would do. But it wasn't necessarily simply my idea. We were all thinking it, but somebody had to say it out loud. Okay? But all of that came from me living and spending so much time at this observatory and seeing that data, and then seeing what occurred to Sharmila and all the other stuff that people went through. Single dish observatories don't get the financial support that the big fancy observatories such as an interferometer will get, because they do such amazing science, those telescopes. But so does this one. It's our software, it's our wetware in our heads that limits the power of this telescope. We can design interesting experiments that this telescope can do. Now, I can tell you this, and this is again not going to be, it's not a spoiler alert. I'm going to say this straight up. We need to monitor masers and the stuff we do. We need to do time domain science on interferometers ultimately, because quite frankly, the perfect telescope does interferometry, all transitions, monitors all the time, and sees as many sources as humanly possible. And that's the perfect radio observatory. That's the perfect observatory, not radio observatory, observatory. I like to refer to it as the Enterprise receivers. So if you remember the TV series, The Enterprise, they would be able to look at all sorts of transitions up to ultra high frequency to very low frequency. They got it all instantaneously. And they would monitor it long period and so on and so forth. And that's the kind of telescope we should be building. So to me, that's the next generation. The next generation is not James Webb. It's not, it's not Hubble. It's none of that. The next generation is a telescope that does everything. Because our technology has to go. We would have to change all of the receivers. Where's my mouse? There it is. We'd have to change all the receivers so that they have very broadband to cover that frequency range. You could imagine trying to do optical with a telescope this size, or infrared. But my point is, and then we have to do it in interferometry mode, and that in itself has incredible amounts of troubles. Over those distances, the timing signals that we'd have to have, the accuracy would have to be unbelievable. So all of these technologies don't exist for some of the stuff that I'm talking about, but that's where we should be thinking about. That's what we should be dreaming of. So I hope that one day, 50 years from now, 20 years from now, Christ, I hope 10 years from now, but say 50 years from now, there's a person doing this kind of media telling the world how they loved working at an observatory that did all transitions, monitored continuously all the time. I want to see that. I would love to be around to see that. I'd love to be able to go into the future and see the telescopes that they're going to have operating. And I can tell you, it's going to do time domain. It's going to do interferometry. It's going to do all of this. Let me tell you what you can do. Let's not be silly here. If I was monitoring in VLBI mode, my masers, just masers, when an accretion event occurred, we can now map the progression of the heat wave coming outward in the disk from the star itself. Okay? And then we can see the radio emission, how it varies, and we can see how the masers turn on and delineate the disk. So we get a spiral. Before the source 358.93 was observed in multiple epochs, Burns et al. Published this in 2000. What was it? 2021, 2022, whenever the hell it was. Can't remember. But they could see a spiral structure, a four-arm spiral. I would never have thought that. In 1984, when I started star formation with Vic Hughes at Queen's University, we just assumed we had a big blob of dust and gas collapsing, becoming flatter, rotating, and forming a star. We never thought of it in terms of a galactic disk structure. So, could you imagine monitoring in real time an accretion event like the S255 or NGC 6334I-MM1, whatever. And I was monitoring it in single dish mode, so I know a bit of what I was talking about, at least above the latter, not the former. And then the other source that we found. And in fact, the reason why it was so exciting to me when I saw that flare was because I was looking at excited OH masers and I thought, hey, we should monitor this source. And I go, hey, we do monitor this source. It's a calibrator. We were using NGC 6334F, as I call it. We were using it as a calibrator for all of our periodicity studies. And so to this day, I'm still finding new and interesting stuff in that particular calibrator, right? So, don't be afraid. So anyways, I found something interesting occurring in the excited OH. I realized we've been monitoring it continuously for years in 6.7 and 12.2 gigahertz. We were monitoring at 1665 and so on, and water masers. So I was able to look at all of those transitions, how they varied during a flaring event. So the first flaring event, or the first one published in Nature, was the same time we were publishing ours in monthly notices and AppJ. We did multiple transitions where they were doing infrared and 6.7, whereas we were doing millimeter astronomy with the ELMA telescope and my multiple maser transition monitoring program. So basically, we both had different approaches, but we both came to the same conclusion, which was fantastic. It was just amazing. We got so lucky to see two accretion events in the same year. And quite frankly, I found an historical one that occurred only a year before. So there was a cluster of these features that occurred within 2 years of each other, and then we only found one in the next 7 years. So since 2015, what's it been? What the hell am I going on? It's been 8 years. So it's been 9 years. So from 2015 to 2024, we've only seen one major accretion event, okay, as we presently define them, okay? Basically changing a couple Janskis a day in flux, okay, at 6.7 gigahertz. But the point is, we got lucky and saw 3 within 2 years of each other. 2 well-studied. The third one found historically in data, but not as well studied. Okay, it was just a pure accident that we found that one, and the other 2, it just happened that people were monitoring these sources looking for periodicity, and at HartRAO we're using this one as a calibrator. So, and all of this from a single dish telescope. You know, so the power of this observatory was that we were doing multiple transitions, monitoring all the time, and suddenly we saw something interesting, and we could rely on other data sets to do that. Well, if we're doing this in VLBI mode, now we can see the heat wave as it expands outward, as it would be turning on those masers. We didn't see that in S255. We didn't see that in NGC. We didn't see that in G323. We only saw it in G358.93 because we finally had a network of telescopes working together. When it happened, we triggered observations. So we only have one example of an illuminated disk during an accretion event. So if we're doing VLBI interferometry, VLBI long-term monitoring of masers, and we see an accretion event, we're going to be able to monitor it in real time as it expands. If we do it in multiple transitions, we can now study the chemistry in that disk. Okay? So, for example, the flare in G358 is methanol dominant. It was basically only seen at effectively 6.7 gigahertz. It was methanol dominant. It had very little hydroxyl. The water wasn't very strong. It had a couple other like ammonia lines, but it was basically methanol. It was basically methanol dominant. Whereas the flare that I looked at in NGC, it was like a Christmas tree of multiple colors. So you had hydroxyl, methanol, water. It had all sorts of transitions. Whereas the other one that was methanol dominant, it had these really bizarre, unique transitions never seen before, never even predicted, never mind never seen. Now, I never looked at those originally for the flaring in NGC, because I never thought of them. They were never predicted, so therefore I didn't look for them. So we never looked for them, and nor did anybody else. So this evolution from S255 and NGC 6334F has led us to what we're seeing in G358.93. And we want to catch more. And if we catch them in interferometry mode, monitoring hundreds of sources all the time, as often as possible in multiple transitions, can you imagine the science we can do? We could study the magnetic field variation as a result of the heat wave traveling out through the region. We can examine the recombination rates of the H2 region itself, plus the maser cloudlets, because they're being affected. So, and never mind that, even if you don't have an accretion event, we go and study periodic methanol masers. We do it in VLBI mode. We know precisely which maser spot is periodic and where they are. And then we get some idea of alignment with the central star. So there's a hell of a lot of science, that we can do. Okay? And then on top of which, right now a lot of people have done proper motion studies using interferometers with water in particular, but they use it to get distance. Okay? So if we're monitoring in VLBI mode, we're going to get proper motion studies by default. So, and you're also going to get the Doppler shift variations. So if the maser is traveling towards the Earth, towards the observer, you're going to see a blue shifting in its velocity. If the maser is traveling transversely in the plane of the sky, parallel to the plane of the sky, you're going to see proper motion. But either one, you can't see the other. Single dish, I cannot see the proper motion. In an interferometer, it's difficult to see the Doppler shift method. You could do it if you monitor it regularly. You can't do it from 1 or 2 epochs. Too difficult. The error is too high. We get the Doppler shift velocity drift basically is the trend that we see. That's the real winner. We see a trend, much like when they do monitoring of the continental plates and how they move on the Earth in geodesy. We win in the trends. We don't win in individual observations. Individual observations, the errors are way too high. Anyways, so I'm telling you guys, this is my observatory. This is the one I loved working on. I liked sitting at the very top of that telescope and just looking out at the world. It was just amazing. I just felt at ease. I always felt home there. And I felt like I belonged. And I would love one day in the future to have some person do a video and say precisely the same about them working at Observatory X. And so I'm going to end on that. This is the video. This was my favorite observatory right here. I really enjoyed working at all the others. I loved going to the VLA. I loved the drive and the observations at Algonquin Park. I really enjoyed working with the people at 5 colleges. You know, and then visiting all the other observatories around the world, like the guys at Green Bank were so friendly, and you just begin to realize the personalities of the people that actually work at observatories. We have a sort of a kinship because we tend to be isolated. We tend to live in very small communities at these places, and you have to have kind of a pioneering spirit. You're probably a little bit of an introvert, but I loved it, and I fit in. I just fit in, you know. That's what it is. And HartRAO was my favorite observatory. And it always will be. No matter what I build in the future, if we build a telescope on Kilimanjaro, if we build this VLBI time machine monitoring system, which I really love, which I'm really working on now, that'll be a great telescope. But this is my first love right here. HartRAO. So on that note, I want all of you to have a good night. Tell me what your favorite observatory is in the chat. Tell me what it is. Tell me where you've gone and you absolutely loved it. And tell me why. You know, just give me just tell me why. Maybe nobody watches this. Maybe I'm just talking to myself. But for posterity, I'm telling the world this was my observatory. And maybe I'm a little weird, but this is mine. HartRAO, Hartebeesthoek Radio Astronomy Observatory, north of Pretoria, South Africa. So good night all.